why you keep thinking about one person. Have you ever tried everything to stop thinking about someone? Keeping yourself busy, watching movies, going to work, spending time with friends. And yet, somehow they always find their way back into your mind. It could be an ex, someone you never had the chance to be with, a close friend you lost, or even someone you barely knew. So why does one person take up so much space in your mind? Is it love, attachment, regret? Or is your brain doing something far more complicated than you realize? Here's something fascinating. Psychologists have found that the people we think about the most aren't always the ones we love the most. Often, they're the ones connected to unresolved emotions, unanswered questions, or experiences our brain never fully processed. In other words, sometimes you're not missing the person, you're missing the emotional closure. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your brain keeps bringing the same person back into your thoughts, what psychology reveals about emotional attachment, and several research-backed strategies that can help you finally find peace and move forward. Welcome back to the channel, or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm a psychologist, and today we're exploring one of the most common questions I hear from patients. Why can't I stop thinking about this one person? We'll explore the neuroscience behind emotional attachment, the psychology of unfinished relationships, a real story from my practice, and practical techniques that can help you understand what your mind is really trying to tell you. If understanding the hidden psychology behind human emotions is something you care about, make sure you're subscribed, because every week we explore the science of the mind, relationships, and the invisible forces that shape our lives. Now, let's begin with what your brain is actually doing when it refuses to let someone go. Researchers studying memory and attachment have found something that should genuinely surprise you. A single person who occupied an emotionally significant role in your life, even briefly, can leave a neurological imprint strong enough that thinking about them years later activates the exact same brain regions involved in physical pain. In one notable line of research, when people were shown a photo of someone who had rejected them, while also undergoing a mild physical pain stimulus, their brains showed overlapping activity in regions associated with both experiences, which means heartbreak isn't just a metaphor. Your brain may be processing the memory of that one person as something closer to an actual injury. Let's start with the foundation of all of this, something called attachment theory. From infancy onward, your brain is wired to form strong bonds with specific people. And once that bond forms, it doesn't simply switch off the moment circumstances change, whether through a breakup, a falling out, distance, or rejection. The attachment system that once helped keep you close to caregivers who protected you doesn't distinguish neatly between healthy, secure bonds and painful, unresolved ones. It simply registers. This person mattered, and once that registration happens, your brain continues monitoring for that person's presence, status, and meaning in your life long after the relationship itself has ended or changed. Here's where it gets more specific, because not all persistent thinking about one person is the same. And there are actually several distinct psychological mechanisms that can be running underneath it, sometimes simultaneously. The first is what researchers call incomplete narrative closure. Human memory strongly favours coherent, resolved stories. And when a relationship ends abruptly, ambiguously, or without a clear explanation, your brain treats that story as unfinished business, an open file it keeps returning to, attempting, in a sense, to find the missing piece that would finally let it close. This is part of why sudden breakups or unexplained ghosting tend to produce far more persistent rumination than relationships that ended with a clear, mutually understood conversation, even when the actual emotional bond wasn't necessarily stronger. The second mechanism is intermittent reinforcement, a concept originally studied in behavioral psychology using simple reward schedules. When attention, affection, or validation from someone is unpredictable, sometimes warm and engaged, sometimes distant and unavailable, it actually creates a stronger psychological pull than consistent, predictable affection does. This sounds backward, but it mirrors exactly how slot machines are designed to be addictive. Unpredictable rewards train the brain to keep checking, keep hoping, keep paying attention, far more powerfully than reliable, predictable outcomes ever could. If the person you can't stop thinking about was inconsistent with you, that inconsistency itself may be a significant part of why your brain won't let them go. The third mechanism is something called the Zeigarnik effect, named after the psychologist who first documented it, which describes the brain's tendency to remember unfinished tasks far more vividly than completed ones. A relationship or connection that ended while still feeling, in some sense, unfinished, words unsaid, feelings unexpressed, a goodbye that never properly happened, tends to occupy far more persistent mental real estate than one that reached a clear, complete ending, regardless of how emotionally significant either relationship actually was. There's also a deeper layer worth naming, particularly for situations involving a person who hurt you or treated you inconsistently. Sometimes the brain keeps returning to someone, not because of how good the relationship was, but in an attempt to retroactively make sense of it. To finally answer the question, why did they treat me that way? What does it say about me? This kind of rumination often isn't really about longing for the person at all. It's an unconscious search for self-understanding. Your mind trying to extract meaning or a lesson from an experience that genuinely confused or destabilized your sense of self at the time. If any of this is resonating with you so far, go ahead and drop a comment telling me whether the person you can't stop thinking about left things unresolved, was inconsistent with you, or something else entirely. I read through these regularly, and if this video is helping you understand your own mind a little better, take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this reach more people who might need to hear it today. I want to tell you about a patient I worked with. I'll call her Beatrice. She was 29 years old, a graphic designer who came to me because nearly 2 years after a relationship had ended, she still found herself thinking about her ex multiple times a day, checking his social media, replaying old conversations, wondering what he was doing, and whether he ever thought about her. Beatrice described feeling deeply ashamed of this, certain that something was wrong with her for not having moved on by now. As we worked through it together, what emerged was that the relationship had ended with him simply growing increasingly distant over several months before disappearing from her life almost entirely, with no real conversation, no clear explanation, nothing that resembled an actual ending. Beatrice's mind had been left holding an open file for 2 years, not necessarily because the relationship itself had been extraordinary, but because it had never been allowed to close. Once Beatrice understood that her persistent thinking was largely the Zeigarnik effect, an incomplete narrative closure working together, rather than proof that she was somehow broken or unusually unable to let go, something genuinely shifted. She stopped treating the intrusive thoughts as evidence of her own failure and started treating them as a closure-seeking mechanism that she could, with deliberate work, help complete on her own terms. So here's what actually helps with this. The first tool is something I call narrative completion, and it directly targets that incomplete closure mechanism. You sit down and write out, in as much detail as needed, the actual ending of the relationship, as it really happened, including the parts that feel unfair, unfinished, or unexplained. And then you deliberately write a closing paragraph, a final statement that you, not the other person, decide marks the actual end of the story. This isn't about pretending you have answers you don't have. It's about giving your own mind the sense of a completed file, since the other person isn't going to provide that closure for you. The second tool directly addresses intermittent reinforcement, where relevant, and it's simply naming the pattern explicitly. If the person you're thinking about was inconsistent, alternating between warmth and distance, it helps enormously to write out specific examples of that inconsistency in plain factual terms, because your brain's longing is often responding more to the unpredictability itself than to the actual person. And clearly seeing that pattern on paper tends to weaken its grip considerably. The third tool is what's sometimes called values-based redirection. Rather than trying to forcibly stop thinking about someone, which research consistently shows backfires and often increases the frequency of the very thought you're trying to suppress, you instead build a specific, ready, alternative focus aligned with something you genuinely care about, a project, a relationship, a physical activity, and you deliberately redirect your attention there each time the intrusive thought arises, treating it less like a battle to win and more like gently turning a wandering attention back towards something meaningful, repeatedly, without judgment, for as many times as it takes. A fourth tool, useful specifically for the self-understanding layer of this, is asking directly, in writing, what does thinking about this person let me avoid asking about myself? Sometimes persistent thoughts about one specific person are quietly protecting you from a more uncomfortable but more useful question about your own patterns, your own needs, or your own unresolved beliefs about your worth. And naming that underlying question directly can be far more productive than continuing to circle the original person indefinitely. Now, an important caution here. This kind of persistent thinking about one person is genuinely common and workable with the tools described here for most people. But if these thoughts have become so intrusive that they significantly interfere with your daily functioning, your work, or your other relationships, if they're tied to a relationship involving genuine abuse or trauma, or if you notice the thinking is accompanied by a depressed mood that doesn't lift, that's worth bringing directly to a licensed mental health professional, because there may be more underlying that benefits from structured clinical support, and reaching out for that support is a sign of strength, not weakness. So let's bring all of this together. Your mind keeps returning to one person largely because of unfinished narrative closure. The Zeigarnik effects pull toward incomplete tasks. The unusually strong grip of intermittent reinforcement when affection was unpredictable. And sometimes an unconscious search for self-understanding, disguised as longing for someone else. None of this means you're broken or unusually unable to move forward. It means your brain is running well-documented psychological patterns, shared by nearly everyone who has ever held on to someone longer than logic alone would suggest. By writing your own narrative completion, naming inconsistency clearly when it was present, building a values-based redirection for your attention, and asking what the persistent thought might be helping you avoid about yourself, you give your mind an actual path toward genuine closure instead of an endless circling loop. If this video helped you understand your own mind a little better, I have a follow-up video right after this one on exactly how chronic stress physically reshapes the brain over time. And I think you'll find it just as worth your time, so go ahead and click through to that next. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, take a moment to send it their way. If you're struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out to one. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.